In previous episodes of the show, we've spent a lot of time talking about the usefulness of grids. One of the big things that a grid gives you is a kind of regularity to the pacing, in that no particular image is necessarily weighed above the rest. You can use a grid to make a page layout essentially sort of invisible, in that the formation of the grid itself can put less emphasis on any particular moment, and instead on presenting a clean series of images. So it's not always the case, of course, right? None of these choices are kind of binary, and I'd suggest you check out the other episodes on the 9-panel grid that I've done in the past to get kind of different ideas on how they can be used. But for this episode, I wanted to look back at Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell's phenomenal work in From Hell, and 2 instances in which the grid is used to make the layout invisible, and how in doing that, Campbell and Moore are able to do something else with their storytelling through the page. You're watching Strip Pile Naked, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. So here's a 3-page sequence from Chapter 8 of From Hell, which is a story about the Jack the Ripper murders in London, and in this particular sequence, we see the murderer enacting one of his kills, juxtaposed with a speech being given by William Morris in a room somewhere near the murders. It's just like a building behind. This set of pages becomes something kind of like the bread and butter of Moore's sort of mid-80s comic book writing, and it's very clear and simple understanding to me of how utilising a standard and uniform structure gives you a particular kind of control over the presentation of the imagery. So in this sequence, the images switch between the murder and William Morris's speech. Never do the two cross, right? Morris's dialogue is never laid over the scenes of the murder or vice versa. So we get one panel of murder, one panel of speech, one panel of murder, more or less, for the duration of 3 pages. So the first point here is in how the regularity of the panel sizes and placement being in the grid means that the whole thing has a steady and constant rhythm to it. The murder panels aren't bigger and more explosive, they're presented exactly the same as William Morris's speech. This allows a certain constructed pace, but it also means that we just don't see the murder as especially extreme in its presentation. It becomes very routine because everything else in the world looks the same. Even though what we're seeing is, terrifying, the fact it stays within the constructed grid means it maintains a certain amount of sort of straightforwardness to the presentation of it. There's an absolutely fantastic example of this later on in From Hell at the start of Chapter 10, which details one of the more gruesome murders. There are about 9 pages at the start of this chapter of mostly silent procedure and murder. The grid maintains a sort of boring regularity, which adds a sort of mundanity to everything, because no single moment is allowed to expand out beyond anything else. Everything is given the same space to work with, page after page after page. And combining that with this sort of mostly eye-level framing makes it all feel almost unremarkable. Or more interestingly, aiming to present the horrific act we're seeing as unremarkable, which is obviously quite different. So the grid here becomes invisible in its mundanity, essentially. The routine 9-panel grid structure allows that level of nothing being allowed to be visually bombastic. Nothing is able to rise above the shoulders of any other image. Everything is the same, each moment is just another moment. The grid allows nothing more. If you want to understand how a grid can sort of really control the way we interpret a scene, that chapter is a very interesting one to look at, because it restrains essentially almost every single image of a very horrific act. So jumping back to this sequence in the earlier chapter, we can see how, with that example of Chapter 10 in context, everything is being drenched in this mundanity. So the other major point then becomes, my favourite thing to say about comics, is the juxtaposition between these two things. Regarding the previous point, there's an added extra level of matter-of-factness being applied, because we're jumping between a more or less static shot of William Morris delivering this speech, almost, directly to us as readers, and you can watch the last episode on Oshimi's Blood in the Tracks for more about that idea of kind of eye engagement with a reader. So this groundedness ends up doing 2 things, right? It really hammers home the horror of what we're seeing in the other panels, but it also breaks up the moments of the murder. It stops the murder from being kind of visually overwhelming, which means it feels, again, much more routine, much more mundane. A well-designed way to stop the grotesqueries from feeling like the point of the scene, instead allowing the murder to seem like a series of moments and just kind of routine decisions on the part of the murderer, which is his character William Gull. That juxtaposition is also aided by the dialogue, right? Primarily there is only dialogue in the panels with Morris. There is only one panel of the murder scene with dialogue at the top of the 2nd page, otherwise it is silence. And the way comics work mean that we read that text and we kind of play it against the image we see, right? That's just the fundamentals of kind of reading an image. The text informs the way we see the image, and having now seen the image, that can also impact the way we engage with the text we just read. It's a back and forth relationship. So we read Morris's speech and we relay it against the image of him speaking, of course, for the context. But the lack of dialogue in the murder panels means that we also end up applying that text to those panels. For example, when Morris says, "Cry out to deaf ears that would hear if they could," The next image is that of a hand over a mouth, stopping the character from screaming, essentially crying out to deaf ears, right? And this is pretty standard Moore affair, of course, but it raises a really interesting point about the juxtaposition in comics. When we present words and then silence in another panel, those words end up lingering, very specifically because of the structure of comics. What I mean by this is that comics work by relating us one image against another. We do that in film too, but we have 24 images a second to relate against each other in film, and that creates the movement. But in comics, we are the movement, the reader is the movement. So we much more directly have to create context between images placed next to each other. If you think about Naoki Urasawa's scene transitions that happen mid-page, he leaves a large gutter between two completely separate moments and locations, and that distance, that small bit of gutter distance, gives you time to reset, essentially, to say that the image you just saw and the image you're about to see, you don't need to relate those two things to each other. But when you place two images right next to each other, we specifically have to relate them in some way. And when we don't have any words to read on a panel, we have to relate the images specifically to what we just saw, which in this case is Morris's dialogue, because these panels don't give us much else to work with. One thing Moore and others have done in their comics is use caption boxes that trail the dialogue over the next image, which very directly creates kind of a correlation between the images you're seeing and those words. Things like Watchmen did that quite a lot, of course, and it can be a very in-your-face technique. What Moore and Campbell do here instead is, while not entirely subtle, a lot more subtle. We are the arbiters of that connection, right, rather than the comic directly forcing us to make that connection, even though that's clearly the effect anyway. But the comic then asks us as readers to put it together rather than making us do so. And in that is a certain power, right, of bringing the reader in to make the connection, which makes us much more directly part of the storytelling process. Again, calling back to last time's episode on eye contact in Blood in the Tracks, asking a reader to create meaning through juxtaposition is a way that comics have of making the reader take some authorship over the narrative, which is a useful tool in making a reader more directly invested in the story being told, because they're essentially the major factor in making it work. And this is all aided again by the grid, right? If what I try and show on Strip Panel Naked is many different possibilities to approach storytelling in comics, each of those also comes with their own rationale and reasoning too. And something here that we see is a lot of restraint, right? This grid, this approach that Campbell has in this drawing and framing is just all restraint. And in the restraint is the previous point about the images all being the same size to add a sense of mundanity. But also it is a way to create sort of a more direct juxtaposition. When we're comparing images, it's much easier if the images are directly placed next to each other and they're the same size. It restrains and limits the amount of variables that we're being asked to consider and read in each moment. Much like the Headlopper episode from way back when, of repeating an image with a few changes to show time passing, this is essentially the same function. Presenting images that are the same size and on the same tier, so, a grid, Moore and Campbell ask us more directly to make a comparison between those two things placed next to each other, and therefore to allow the dialogue to drift across the panels and moments too, which creates the main effect of this sequence. What I find so interesting in writing about this is that these are really, really basic fundamental points about comics, right? They're just basically how comics work. Images next to each other, relating text and visuals. And yet, even just this pretty simple example shows how, in only using just that basic concept, nothing too flashy, you can create an incredibly powerful set of pages. There's no massive visual bombast and flash here, just basic approaches to comics, right? Done well. And yet it's one of my favourite sequences in all of From Hell. A way to control the reader, while also asking the reader to have a valuable input into the unravelling of the sequence. I don't know how comics get much better than that. Thanks for watching. If you're a fan of Strip Panel Naked, the series continues thanks to our amazing patrons. You can support the channel over at patreon.com/strippanelnaked, and in return, you'll get access to over 4 years of exclusive writing, annotated pages from comics, and reading lists that you can't see anywhere else. You'll also get a discount, or if you're a top tier patron, you'll get a free copy of the magazine that I edit, the Eisner-winning Panel by Panel magazine. Every month in that magazine, we get the very best critics and the very best creators to look in depth at the medium and discuss why comics are such an exciting form to tell stories in. If you like Strip Panel Naked, you like what we do on the channel, you will love Panel by Panel. You can also follow me on Twitter at HassanOE, and of course, hit subscribe and that notification bell right here on YouTube to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and I will see you next time.